Every institution that has ever lasted long enough to matter has a room that nobody talks about. Not the ceremonial rooms, not the grand halls where history is performed for cameras and crowds, and the careful management of public memory. The other room, the one where the real records are kept, where the decisions that cannot be announced are documented anyway, because people who understand power understand that documentation is protection, and protection is everything. Where the paper trail that nobody was supposed to follow was laid down anyway, because the person laying it down understood that there would come a day when it would need to be found. In the British royal household, that room existed. It existed inside Windsor Castle, in an office that was not on the standard palace floor plan available to staff, not listed in the administrative directory used by the household management team, and not accessible through the standard system of key allocation that governs movement through the castle's less ceremonial spaces. It was, by every account of those who knew of its existence, a private administrative space, a working office maintained by the Parker Bowles family's informal palace operation. A space where the documentation of their activities within the royal household was kept not in the formal palace record-keeping system, but in a parallel and entirely private filing architecture. And inside that space, according to sources whose familiarity with what followed gives their account a weight that is difficult to dismiss, was a ledger, not metaphorical, physical, a bound volume of private records, annotated, cross-referenced, detailed, that captured, across a period of several years, the specific and systematic ways in which the Parker Bowles family had used their proximity to the Crown to secure benefits, appointments, and accommodations that the formal record of the palace did not reflect, and that the institution's own governance structures had not approved. It has been called, by the people who have seen its reported contents, and who have chosen to describe it in terms that communicate its significance, without understating it, the Black Ledger. Prince William has reportedly authorized its release, and the institution has not been the same since. If you are not subscribed to this channel, do that right now, because what I am about to walk you through is not a story about palace gossip or the theatrical drama of a family that happens to live in castles. It is a story about power, about how power is accumulated quietly inside institutions that assume good faith from the people within them, about how the documentation of that accumulation becomes, at the moment of its discovery, the most powerful tool available to the person who finds it, and about what happens when a future king decides that the moment for using that tool has arrived. Tap that bell, stay with me. This is the one that changes everything. Let us start with the Black Ledger itself, because the details of what it contains, and how it was maintained, and by whom, and why the decision was made to keep it separate from the formal palace record, are the foundation on which everything else in this story rests. Without understanding the ledger, you cannot fully understand William's decision to authorize its release. And without understanding that decision, you cannot understand what it means for Camilla, for Charles, for the institution, and for the question of where real power now sits inside the British monarchy. The ledger was not a single document created at a single moment for a single purpose. It was, by all accounts, an accumulated record, something that grew over years, maintained by a small number of people close to the Parker Bowles operation within the palace, updated as new arrangements were made, and new benefits were secured, and new accommodations were extended to members of Camilla's family and their associated circle. It was, in the most precise sense, a private administrative archive, the kind of archive that any sufficiently organized operation creates when it needs to keep track of its own activities, when the number of arrangements in play is large enough that informal memory cannot reliably maintain a complete picture. The problem, from the perspective of the institution that it recorded, is not that such records exist. Documentation of activity is not, in itself, problematic. The problem is what the documentation reveals about the nature of the activity being recorded, because the patterns captured in the ledger, the patterns that sources familiar with its reported contents describe as systematic rather than occasional, deliberate rather than incidental, and coordinated rather than arising from independent decisions made by individuals acting without reference to each other, paint a picture of an operation that was, in the language of institutional governance, significantly beyond what the palace had formally sanctioned. The specific categories of activity recorded in the ledger, as described by those familiar with its contents, fall into several distinct areas. The first is estate usage. The ledger apparently documents in considerable detail the occasions on which royal properties, Balmoral, Sandringham, Windsor, and several secondary residences were used by members of the Parker Bowles family and their associates in circumstances that were not formally recorded in the standard palace estate management system. Not overnight stays by family members attending official events. The kind of stays that were not recorded at all in the official system, that did not appear on the estate management logs, did not generate the standard notifications to household staff through the normal channels, and did not leave the kind of documented footprint that the palace's formal accountability mechanisms are designed to capture. The second category is staff appointments. The ledger apparently records a series of appointments and informal staff assignments that were made through channels that bypassed the normal palace HR processes. Appointments that placed individuals with connections to the Parker Bowles family in positions within the household that gave them access to resources, information, and institutional leverage without the formal oversight that standard appointment processes provide. Some of these were described in the accounts of the ledger's contents as informal positions, arrangements that gave the functions of a staff role without the formal title, accountability, or documentation that would allow the institution to track what those individuals were doing and on whose behalf. The third category is perhaps the most significant, both institutionally and politically. The ledger apparently documents a series of communications and coordination activities, meetings, exchanges, decisions that took place within the palace environment, but outside the formal structures of the household, between members of the Parker Bowles circle and individuals in positions that gave them influence over the institution's decisions on matters ranging from financial allocations to event planning to the management of specific relationships within the broader royal family. Communications that would not appear in the formal palace record because they were deliberately conducted through informal channels, in person, through intermediaries, in spaces not covered by the standard record-keeping that the household's formal operations generate. This is the core of what the Black Ledger documents, not crimes in the strict legal sense. The sources who have described its contents are uniformly careful on this point, but a systematic pattern of activity that operated outside the institution's formal governance structures in ways that gave the Parker Bowles operation an influence over palace affairs that was significantly greater than their formal institutional standing, justified, and that was maintained through a deliberate and coordinated approach to staying below the threshold of formal accountability. Drop a comment right now telling me what you think about that. Because the distinction between what is formally prohibited and what is institutionally inappropriate is one that tends to get lost in the excitement of revelations like this one, and it matters more than it might initially appear. What the Black Ledger describes is not a corruption scandal in the conventional sense. It is something subtler and in many ways more damaging to an institution that depends on public trust, a pattern of behavior that demonstrates that the people engaged in it understood that their activities would not withstand the scrutiny of the formal system and chose deliberately to conduct those activities in ways designed to avoid that scrutiny. In an institution that exists on the basis of the public's trust that it is governed according to the principles it publicly claims to uphold, that is about as serious as it gets. The discovery of the ledger, the moment when its existence became known to William's team, rather than remaining exclusively within the knowledge of the people who had maintained it, is itself a story worth telling properly, because it did not happen through a dramatic raid or a formal investigation or the kind of high-profile confrontation that makes its way into newspapers. It happened, according to sources, in the way that the most consequential palace discoveries always happen, through the patient, methodical work of people conducting a routine review who found something that was not routine. The office in which the ledger was stored was discovered during what has been described as an administrative audit of Windsor Castle's lesser-used spaces, a review of the physical plant that was part of a broader effort to account for all of the spaces within the castle that were being used for administrative or storage purposes in the context of the ongoing assessment of the royal household's operational requirements under the new reign. It was not a targeted search. It was not the product of a specific tip or a particular suspicion about what might be found. It was a routine administrative exercise that produced an entirely non-routine discovery. The office itself, The physical space where the ledger was kept was found in a part of Windsor Castle that has not been in regular use for formal palace functions for several years. A secondary administrative corridor, the kind of space that exists in every large building with a complex history, where the formal use designation has not kept pace with the informal use reality. The space was not, according to those familiar with its discovery, in poor condition. It was in active use, not daily. The physical evidence suggested irregular visits rather than regular occupation, but maintained, organized, secured in a way that indicated that the people who used it understood that the security of its contents mattered. The ledger was found in a locked filing cabinet. The lock required a key that was not in the standard palace key management system. The finding of the key and the decision about whether to use it was itself a moment that sources describe as significant. A moment when the people conducting the review understood that they had found something that exceeded the normal scope of a routine administrative exercise and that required escalation to a level of authority that could make a properly informed decision about how to proceed. That level of authority in the current palace environment is William's. The decision about what to do with the ledger's contents once they were known, once the pattern they documented had been assessed by the people competent to assess it, was not simple or quick. It involved, according to sources familiar with the deliberations, a period of careful consideration that tested several competing principles simultaneously. The principle that the institution's internal affairs should be managed internally, without the kind of public disclosure that creates collateral damage, extending beyond the specific individuals involved. The principle that the documentation of systematic inappropriate activity creates an obligation to address that activity through means proportionate to its seriousness. The principle that the current moment, the moment in which William is actively building the institutional framework of the monarchy he will lead, is one in which the establishment of clear standards of accountability is more important than the preservation of the comfortable ambiguity that has allowed inappropriate patterns to persist. The tension between those principles was real and was taken seriously. William is not, by any account of the people who work with him, a person who makes significant decisions without weighing them carefully. He understands that the release of the Parker Bowles files, the communication of the ledger's existence and the patterns it documents to the relevant institutional authorities is an act with consequences that extend beyond the immediate situation. It affects his relationship with his father. It affects the stability of the household in a period when the institution is already navigating significant transition. It affects the public perception of the monarchy's internal governance in ways that cannot be fully predicted or controlled. He weighed all of that, and he authorized the release anyway. The question that I want to address directly, because it is the question that the most serious analysis of this situation requires: why now, at this specific moment in the history of the current reign, did William conclude that the documentation of what the Parker Bowles operation had been doing inside the palace needed to be brought formally to light? What was the specific calculation that led him to the conclusion that the discomfort of disclosure was worth accepting in exchange for the institutional clarity that disclosure would produce? The answer, according to sources close to his thinking, is about precedent. Not immediate precedent, not the specific impact on Camilla or on the Parker Bowles family's current position within the palace, but the long-term precedent that is being established right now about what the standards of the institution William will lead actually are and how seriously they are enforced. William has spent the past 2 years making a series of decisions: the seating arrangements, the financial audit, the jewelry custody orders, the access revocations that, taken individually, can be understood as responses to specific situations. Taken together, they form a coherent institutional program, the systematic establishment of the principle that proximity to the crown is not a substitute for accountability, that informal influence does not carry the same weight as formal institutional standing, and that the people who benefit from their relationship to the monarchy are subject to the same standards of transparency and good governance that the monarchy publicly claims to uphold. The Parker Bowles files are the most dramatic and most concrete expression of that program. They represent the moment when the principle moves from the realm of policy statements and procedural changes into the realm of documented historical fact. They say, here is the evidence that the informal culture of this institution has produced patterns of behavior that its stated values cannot accommodate. Here is the documentation of exactly what happens when proximity to power is not subject to the kind of oversight that genuine accountability requires. And here is what it looks like when the person responsible for ensuring that the next generation of this institution meets a higher standard decides that the time for indirect pressure has passed and the time for documented institution fact has arrived. That is a significant step. It is arguably the most significant institutional step that William has taken since his father's accession, and the question of what it means for Camilla, for her position, for her future within the institution, for the question of what the Queen Consort role looks like in the years before Charles eventually hands the throne to his son, is one that deserves careful and honest analysis. Subscribe if you are not already watching this channel, and please share this video, because the analysis of what the Parker Bowles files mean for the future of the monarchy is the kind of serious institutional examination that this community does better than anywhere else online. Camilla's position in the aftermath of the release is, according to sources close to the situation, one of the most difficult she has faced since the years of her most intense public unpopularity in the period following Diana's death. The specific difficulty of the current situation is different in nature from those earlier difficulties. It is not about public hostility or media disdain, or the judgment of a public that had not yet decided to accept her. It is about something more intimate and more structurally significant. The formal institutional acknowledgement that the operation she presided over inside the palace did not meet the standards that the institution's stated governance principles require. She has not made a public statement. Her office has not acknowledged the ledger or its discovery or the question of what its contents document. The surface, as it always does with Camilla, holds with remarkable composure. The public schedule continues. The official appearances proceed. The visible life of the Queen Consort goes on with the practiced regularity that has characterized her public existence since she entered royal life. But the institutional reality beneath that surface has changed in ways that cannot be reversed by composure or by the continuation of a public schedule. The ledger exists. Its contents have been assessed by people whose institutional authority is not contingent on their relationship to Camilla. The patterns it documents are now part of the formal record of the institution's understanding of what happened in its own corridors. And William, who authorized the release of that record, has made clear that he considers the documentation of what happened to be more important than the discomfort that its documentation creates. For Camilla, the question is not primarily about survival. Her position as Queen Consort is constitutionally and personally secured in ways that the discovery of a private ledger, however damaging its contents, cannot directly undermine. It is about influence, about the informal power that she and her circle have accumulated and exercised within the institution over the years of her relationship with Charles, about whether that power can be maintained in a context where its exercise has now been documented in ways that make its maintenance politically and institutionally untenable. The answer, based on everything that has happened in the past several weeks, appears to be no. The eviction notices, the formal communications that have been issued to certain members of staff, whose appointments were documented in the ledger, and whose positions within the palace are now under formal review, are the most concrete expression of that answer. People are being asked to leave. Positions are being reviewed. The informal network that the ledger documents is being dismantled, not through a dramatic purge or a public announcement, but through the steady, methodical process of reviewing each appointment and each arrangement on its own merits, according to the formal governance standards that should have been applied in the first place. The King's response to all of this has been, by all accounts, the most difficult element of the entire situation. Charles is a man who loves his wife. He is a man who has spent the better part of his adult life in relationship with Camilla, who navigated, at enormous personal cost and through a period of sustained public hostility that would have broken many people, the path from an impossible private situation to the formal public recognition that his relationship with her deserved. He is not a man for whom the institutional exposure of the operation around his wife is an abstract or emotionally uncomplicated event. And yet his response when William brought the ledger's contents to him through the formal channels that the situation required was, according to sources, 3 words. Just 3 words, delivered in the quiet and settled tone that those who know him describe as his register for moments when he has made a decision and has no intention of revisiting it. He looked at the documentation, he considered what he was being shown, and he said, "Proceed with everything." 3 words. An entire institutional direction, a decision that authorized William to act on the ledger's contents through the formal channels available to him, to pursue the staff reviews and the access revocations and the formal documentation of the institutional record that the situation required, and to do all of this with the king's explicit endorsement rather than in the face of his resistance. Those 3 words are the most important thing Charles has said in the context of the palace power shift that has been building for the past 2 years. Because they represent something that Charles could not easily have been predicted to do, they represent him choosing the institution over his domestic peace, choosing his obligations as king over his protectiveness as a husband, choosing the future of the monarchy which belongs to William over the comfort of the present which belongs to him and to Camilla. That choice has a cost. Sources describe the domestic atmosphere within the shared royal residences as considerably more strained than the public appearances of Charles and Camilla would suggest. The warmth that characterizes those joint appearances is professional and deliberate and real, in the sense that 2 people who have loved each other for 50 years do not stop feeling the connection that's sustained, that love simply because an institutional crisis has intervened. But beneath the warmth, the situation they are navigating is as difficult as anything they have navigated together. And the difficulty, this time, is not external, not a hostile public or a critical media or the judgment of an institution that had not yet decided to accept them. The difficulty is internal, is the consequence of how the operation around Camilla conducted itself inside the institution, is, in the end, the consequence of decisions made by people close to her, whose activities she may not have fully directed, but whose proximity to her gave those activities the institutional shelter that made them possible. This is the genuinely painful dimension of the Parker Bowles files for Camilla specifically. The ledger does not document her direct personal involvement in every activity it records, but it documents those activities in the context of an operation that existed to serve her interests and that derived its capacity to act from her position within the institution. The distinction between being the direct actor and being the principal, whose position enabled others to act, is a real distinction, but it is also in the court of institutional judgment, a distinction that provides less protection than it might provide in a legal context. You are, in the world of institutional accountability, responsible for the culture that surrounds you, responsible for the activities of the people who act in your name, responsible for the consequences of the informal power that your position generates, whether or not you explicitly directed its exercise. Camilla knows this, and those around her know it, and the question of how she navigates the months ahead, how she rebuilds the institutional credibility that the ledger's existence has damaged, how she manages her public role in a context where the private operation that has supported that role is being systematically dismantled, how she maintains a relationship with William that allows the institution to function without the kind of open conflict that would damage everyone involved, is the most significant unanswered question in the current palace environment. Let me tell you what I think is the most important thing about this entire story. Not the ledger itself, not the eviction notices, not even the king's 3-word response. The most important thing is what the existence of the ledger reveals about the informal culture of the royal household, and why William's decision to address it formally rather than informally represents a genuine and durable shift in how the institution is governed. Institutions that rely on informal understandings rather than documented accountability are institutions that are vulnerable to exactly the kind of behavior the ledger documents. They are vulnerable because the informality creates space between what the formal rules require and what the actual practice permits, and that space, in any institution populated by human beings with interests and ambitions, and the capacity to act on them, will be used, not always badly, not always with the intention of circumventing the institution's stated values, but used, and the use over time becomes practice, and the practice becomes expectation, and the expectation becomes culture, and the culture eventually produces the kind of systematic pattern that a ledger like this one documents. William has spent his adult life watching this happen, watching the informal culture of the royal household generate, periodically and with painful regularity, the kind of behavior that damages the institution's credibility, precisely because it contradicts the values the institution publicly claims to uphold. Watching the institution manage those moments through a combination of silence, slow adjustment, and the hope that the public's attention will move on before the full scope of the problem becomes visible. Watching the cost of that approach accumulate year by year in the form of declining public trust and increasing public impatience with the gap between the monarchy's stated values and its actual conduct. He has decided that the gap will be closed, not through rhetoric or through the public performance of institutional reform, but through the systematic documentation and institutional confrontation of the specific practices that created it. The Black Ledger is the most dramatic instance yet of that determination, but it is not the last. The approach it represents, find the evidence, assess it formally, act on what it shows, accept the discomfort that action creates, is an approach that William has adopted as a governing principle for the institution he will lead. That principle is now visible, not just to the people within the palace who have been watching the internal shifts and trying to interpret their direction, to everyone watching from outside, to the public that has for decades been told that the monarchy is a model of duty and transparency, and that has been watching with increasing skepticism for the behavior that would justify that characterization. To the institutional observers and the constitutional analysts and the people who take seriously the question of whether the British monarchy is sufficiently well governed to deserve its continued place in the structure of the British state, William has shown them something real. He has shown them a future king who uses the authority available to him to confront rather than conceal the institutional failures of his own household, who accepts the personal and political cost of formal disclosure rather than managing inconvenient truths through the comfortable ambiguity of silence, who treats the documented evidence of governance failure as a basis for institutional reform rather than as a problem to be managed away. That is not a small thing. In the long history of an institution that has managed most of its most difficult moments through silence and patience and the hope that time would resolve what courage could not, it is actually a remarkable thing. And the question of whether it represents a permanent shift in the character of royal governance or a specific response to a specific situation that will give way in time to the more comfortable informality of the old culture is the question that will define the next chapter of this reign and the reign that follows it. The comments are where this conversation belongs. Tell me what you think. Tell me whether you believe William's decision to authorize the release of the Parker Bowles files was the right call, and what you think the right call looks like when the institution's formal governance obligations come into direct conflict with the domestic peace of the household. Tell me whether you think Camilla can survive this moment politically and institutionally, or whether the ledger represents the beginning of a formal decline in her influence from which she will not recover. Tell me whether the king's three-word response strikes you as an act of institutional integrity or as an act of self-protection, a choice to align himself with the more powerful institutional force rather than the more personally beloved one. Tell me whether you think this is the final move in the power struggle for the heart of the monarchy or whether the real final move is still to come. Because William, as we have noted across multiple stories on this channel, does not move without a full picture of where he is going. The Parker Bowles files are not his end game. They are his most powerful statement yet of the principle that will govern his end game. And the end game, when it arrives, will be the most consequential moment in the history of this institution since the death of Diana. Subscribe, like, share this video with every serious royal watcher in your network. The Black Ledger has been opened. The files are out. And the institution, the thousand-year institution that has survived everything history has thrown at it, by being at its best willing to confront the truth about itself, is being asked, right now, by the man who will one day wear its crown, to be its best self. Whether it rises to that moment is the story we are all living through in real time, and we will be here for every chapter of it. Let me leave you with one final thought, because it is the thought that has sat with me throughout the process of researching and reporting this story, and I think it deserves to be said clearly rather than implied. The Black Ledger exists because someone decided to keep records. Someone close to the Parker Bowles operation within the palace made a decision years ago to document the activities of that operation in a level of detail that went well beyond what informal coordination would require. That decision, whatever motivated it, organizational habit, personal caution, the instinct of someone who understood that documented evidence is protected evidence, produced the very instrument that now threatens the operation it was designed to serve. There is a lesson in that, not a comfortable one, and not one that is unique to the British royal family. Institutions that operate in the gap between their stated values and their actual practice generate, in the normal course of their activity, the evidence of that gap. The evidence accumulates. It sits in filing cabinets in secondary administrative corridors. It waits with the patient indifference of paper and ink for the person who will eventually find it and understand what it means. William found it. He understood what it meant, and he made the decision that the evidence required him to make. The decision that every person in a position of institutional responsibility is supposed to make when they find evidence that the institution they are accountable for has not met its own standards. He did not bury it. He did not manage it quietly into irrelevance. He brought it formally into the institutional record and authorized the consequences that the record demands. That is leadership, uncomfortable, costly, personally and politically expensive leadership. But leadership, and in an institution that has not always had it in sufficient supply, at sufficient courage, at sufficient consistency, it matters more than it might in an institution that takes it for granted. The Parker Bowles files are now part of the palace's formal institutional record. The pattern they document is known. The people responsible for the consequences of that pattern are navigating those consequences right now, in the private and contested space between public composure and institutional reckoning. And William is watching with the patience and the precision that characterize everything he does to ensure that the consequences are proportionate, durable, and ultimately formative, that they produce not just the removal of specific individuals from specific positions, but the cultural change that makes the repetition of the documented patterns impossible. That is the audit of the century, not the financial audit we reported on previously, the audit of the institution itself, of its informal culture, of the gap between what it says and what it does, of the distance between the public values it claims and the private conduct it has too often allowed. William is closing that gap, one file at a time, one decision at a time, one three-word royal response at a time. And the monarchy, if it is wise enough to let him, will emerge from this process as something that deserves the trust it asks the public to extend to it, something that is earned through the hard and unglamorous work of genuine institutional reform, the right to continue being what it has been for 1,000 years, the living symbol of continuity, duty, and the idea that public service is its own reward. The files are out. The ledger is open. The reckoning has begun. We will be watching every moment of it.